Saffron, and I am the chair of the session today. And it is great to see so many of you here. We will do the introduction of the speakers in a minute, but just to make sure that you are in the right place, I will tell you the title of the session is Climate Change, Conflict Causes and Conflict Prevention. That's the title. So if you're in the right place, you're in the right place. And I think on the program, this is probably it's a quite broad topic, which is really nailing the main theme of this conference. I think we can fit a lot of things into this theme. Clearly, we will be looking at, I guess everyone in the room would agree that climate change is upon us as we speak. The impacts of climate change are already here. We are now at 1.1 degrees warming. If we follow the trajectory of the current NDC, we will be on pathways to the disastrous 2.7, right? And we already see the impact of the changing climate, and we are here exactly to discuss the very, very complex, interconnected nature of climate change on society, especially armed conflict around the world. The way that I interpret the topic is that we will be looking at those interlinkages between climate change and how climate change impacts conflict in local communities, both horizontal conflicts between communities and also internally in communities, but also vertically, how conflicts also can be between communities and the states and internationally. So I think we have room to cover quite a bit of ground. And with this vast interest in the room, feel free to bring out your experiences in this area. Now, and the second thing is conflict prevention, right? That's also in the title. So we will also be exploring how our actions to either address peace or addressing climate change, how those responses are interconnected at local levels, national levels, and also in terms of the international corporations that many of us are engaged in, right? So how can our interventions both be a trigger of the good stuff, but if we do it wrongly, if we don't understand those interconnectedness, the interconnectedness, we can get it wrong, which can lead to enhanced conflicts, and also maladaptation and so forth, right? So I think that's quite clear. Any comments or questions around the topic, the theme, anything? All good so far? Great. So I don't know if I said my name. My name is Ingvild Solvang. I'll try to keep it there. It's easier when you see it in writing. I am joined today, and just right off the bat, we've had a plot twist, a quite significant plot twist in this session, in that two of our speakers did not make it. So let's take a moment to reflect on the problem of visas to Europe and people not being able to be represented at conferences like this. And that is Boubacar from Mali. He was meant to present. His internet connection is also not good enough to get him online unless you see him. If you do see him, shout. And then we also had from Nepal, Kurmaraj Shahi, who also did not make it. So that means that for those of you who had a very special interest in Mali and Nepal for this session, unfortunately they are not here. But instead, and as per program, we are here with Laurence, Delina from the Philippines. You want to say 2 words about yourself?
Oh yeah, I'm Laurence, and I'm an assistant professor of environment and sustainability at the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. I'm a Filipino working mostly on Southeast Asia.
And he will be getting an award tomorrow. So
thank you.
So very nice to have you here. And online we have Sarah Posner. She is with the with the University of Colorado in Boulder, and she's a PhD candidate. She will be giving a presentation. So Laurence and Sarah were the originals in the program who will be giving a presentation with PowerPoints. And then I have collected people during the last couple of days for those who cannot be here. So Jennifer, just
Hi. I'm Jennifer. I'm from the University of Vienna, focusing, I'm in my PhD first year, very much at the beginning. And my work focuses on the interplay of biodiversity loss, climate change, and armed conflict.
Roberto.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Roberto Gomez. I work for Chemonics International and run a USA-funded project in the Colombian Amazon called Amazon Alive that intends to help the Colombian society to reduce deforestation in the region and to improve the effectiveness of the governmental actions to tackle this very important problem, not only in terms of climate change.
Well, the four of them will be the panel, and then we hope for you all to chime in, ask questions, answer questions. And I will sit down and be quiet, hopefully, for most of the rest of it. And I'm very, very glad to give it over to you, Laurence, for your presentation.
Thank you so much, Ingvild, and thanks so much for coming over. Yeah, I'm a little bit worried earlier people will not show up. I prepared a few slides, just about 3-4 slides here, I reckon, and I will keep my talk briefly. As when Ingvild was moving around the room asking who are the academics, who are the practitioners in the room, I always have an issue with that because I considered myself as a practitioner as well, not only as an academic. So earlier, I mentioned that I'm from the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. I assume not many of you are familiar with the university. So it's a very young university. We just celebrated our 33rd year this year. But we are a STEM university, a science, technology, engineering, and maths university. So I'm very different in the sense that I do a lot of work in the social sciences. So my presentation today will bring you to Mindanao, which is in the southern part of the Philippines, and particularly in Bangsamoro, which is a region that had become an autonomous only in less than 10 years. So I checked the record earlier. Peace negotiations basically concluded 10 years ago in 2014 with a peace agreement between the Bangsamoro and the Philippine government. And then for a long time, it's considered as one of the longest violent conflict in the world. It started in the 1500s with Spanish colonization. I'll be talking about a new paper that has been published in Climate Risk Management, Living with Climate and State Fragility in a Chaotic Paradise, Securitizing Livelihoods in the Philippine Cotabato River Basin. So this basin is located within that Bangsamoro region. Before I forget, I would like to acknowledge the United States Institute of Peace for generously supporting this project, which we concluded late 2023, and it ran for about 3 years. As you can surmise, it was during the pandemic when we collected data, analyzed data. But there's also, I hope that you can bring in that, you can still recall what pandemic was, and put that up in when thinking about this presentation. So in particular, I will bring you to Ligawasan, which is basically a local term for marsh. Yeah, so Ligawasan is the Philippines' most extensive wetland. It comprises 4 provinces, and we focused on 2 provinces. But before 2023, it was just 1 component province before it was split into 2 late last year. The 4 provinces, about 450 square miles. The name of the people who have been inhabiting there for since time immemorial are the Maguindanao people. So the Danao word is actually means inundated by water. So Maguindanao is part of Mindanao. Mindanao is the largest island. I am from Mindanao myself. So Maguindanao means people of the flooded plain. So you can already say that it's really, livelihoods is really going on in terms of working with the water. So we did interviews and focus groups between November 2021 to January of 2023. So that's about 13 months. Again, COVID pandemic. And go to the next slide. Right, so flooding. Flooding is one of, for many of us, we call it a risk, but it is considered normal quote unquote, in this part of the world. However, the increasing frequency of flooding, particularly flash floods, means the frequency of evacuation as well, right? So if flash floods or flash flooding, of course, there is no time for evacuation, and there's an impact not only on livelihoods, because when there is flooding, once fertile farmlands become inundated and turns into floodplains, so people lost their livelihoods. Next slide. The land use change is basically part and parcel of these changes, and it pans out in terms of livelihood changes. So livelihoods are reduced, therefore income is also lost. Most of the populations of Maguindanao people rely on rice farming or corn farming, but because of flooding, they have issues with that one. So oil palm plantation, which I assume many of you are familiar with that crop, with that mono crop, is state supported in the Philippines, and Maguindanao province is one of the considered fertile ground for planting oil palms. And most of farmers in this area actually have moved out of rice cultivation to oil palm plantation, largely because of the higher labor cost in rice, in rice farming. So alongside land use, there's also an issue with siltation because of flooding. We have silt islands being produced or being created in this place. And to address siltation and address flooding, physical infrastructures, engineering infrastructures are being created or constructed in the area, including cut-off channels. In a while, I'll talk about maladaptation, or probably during the Q&A. But that physical infrastructure is supposed to address flooding, actually altered the flow of the ligawasan into agricultural lands, meaning to say it makes some part of the ligawasan dry, so that opens up agricultural rice cultivation. However, it directed water to other villages, which means that flooding also occurred in other places. There's also an issue of land rights access in these places, which has the deep historical roots from colonization, resettlement programs, people coming from North and Central Philippines in the 1950s, migrating to Mindanao, and of course, the customary land tenure systems in this area. So, but not only about flooding. With intense climate change, this particular part of the world also experiences droughts. And with droughts, we have economic losses and food insecurity. So people are abandoning their farming because there's no irrigation, there's no way to do agriculture. And people who tend to stay, they shift to low gestation or crops with shorter gestation periods, not rice. Rice takes 3 to 4 months to mature, but they shift to vegetables, for example, 2 months, 2.5 months. Next slide. Okay, yep. So violent conflicts emerge out of these extreme weather events and their consequences with livelihood changes. In this particular part of the world, there is this context of RIDO, R-I-D-O. It's basically personal disputes, and this is happening across clans. So this is about feuding, revenge killing, blood revenge or vendetta, which is also deeply rooted in historical grievances of these people. Poverty is a variable, and it's an important variable when you analyze the intersection between violent conflicts, livelihoods, and extreme weather events. I have to mention also that this particular region has the highest poverty incidence in the Philippines. Okay, so how do people here, how do Magandinaoans adapt to this changing events? How do they cope with flooding? How do they cope with droughts? So people simply move out. They are forced to migrate, not migrate outside of the borders, meaning to say there's a spillover effects to nearby provinces. But some people also just stay in. So one of our in a few of our qualitative data, so respondents would say conflict has always been an everyday reality for them, and therefore they just stay in. So next slide. There's none. Okay, so probably that was my last slide. I forgot about my slides. Yeah. So to close, so this is a paper that we have published in December of 2023, and there is another paper that came out in June 2023 in Impacts Journal, Environment and Security Journal. There we make a connection we make a strong case connecting extreme weather events inducing or having some induced relationship with human insecurity, which results to the escalation of violent conflicts. We also made an argument in that paper that livelihood security influences conflict risks, and these conflict risks are largely due to food price increases. Of course, every studies have their own limitations, and one of our key limitation is that we really didn't look at the role of governance. We understand that governance is very important and crucial in terms of climate adaptation. We also didn't look at institutions and social capital in shaping the climate conflict dynamics and in reducing the occurrence of violence. So we are really looking forward to bring this project into Project 2.0, just looking beyond our original work, moving beyond the communities, but really looking at institutional arrangements and governance for ensuring or for arriving at sustainable peace in this world region. Thank you so much.
Right. All right, great. Thank you very much. So that was our example from the Philippines. And I think we see clearly food security, food prices and conflict, infrastructure and adaptation measures to battle flooding, which leads to conflict because the waters flow in various directions. And the issue of governance in institutional arrangements, which we will get back to a little bit also in the context of the Philippines. But let's hear first from Sarah online, who will be talking quite a bit about local institutions and their role in balancing climate change and conflict. So Sarah, if you can hear us.
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
All right. Okay.
See her as well, if there is a way to see her.
Can you guys hear? Am I just a voice?
Yes, we can see you. Great. Go ahead, please, Sarah.
Okay. I will just say there's some animation, so I'll say next for the next animation. You might want to put it in presenter mode.
I put it in presenter mode and we cannot see her.
I think you can drag her on the other side. Yeah, this. Yeah.
Nice. And then can you put it in like slideshow? Okay. That looks good, right? Okay. So that's fine. My name's Sarah. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Colorado Boulder. I've been looking at this question for a while, but I'm focusing more on these local level institutions for my dissertation. So this is a mix right now of my dissertation proposal and this longitudinal study that we conducted in my field site going into the PhD. So it's more theoretical. I'm creating this conceptual framework, and I'd love to hear more on that end, but I do have some results to show as well. So I just wanted to cover the basics of the climate conflict nexus. This is probably a review for most of you, but we know that there's not a unilateral causal pathway between climate change exacerbating conflict. And this chart shows the results from an expert elicitation, which included my advisor on what the main conflict drivers are. You might have seen this article in Nature. And basically they found, you want to click over the animations, that low socioeconomic development, weak states, intergroup inequality, which often occurs along ethnic lines, and a recent history of conflict are actually the best predictors of conflict. But what they found, which was interesting, is that climate variability and change may be one of the least influential now, but going forward, it's the most uncertain. And so that's why we are still looking at this relationship. But I will be really emphasizing these top 4 drivers. Do next slide. Okay, so this is sort of the background of the causal pathways I'm looking at. I'm looking at the role mostly of these natural resource management institutions. So in the context of northern Kenya, there's an increase in intercommunal conflict between pastoralists in the post-colonial era. And in terms of dispute resolution mechanisms in the pre-colonial era, it was traditionally the role of elders to solve these intercommunal conflicts, but their efficacy has waned over time. And this is for many reasons. One of them is the proliferation of small arms from nearby countries has distorted these customary institutions. It's kind of this violent youth hypothesis. There's many other reasons too that these institutions have waned, but they're still important. Northern Kenya is in the periphery of the state, and these customary institutions are still used where there is this weak state presence. So the social outcomes are the big question mark, right? So there's conflicting evidence whether local institutions dampen or exacerbate tensions. This was an article from some of my colleagues in my lab that found that there was variation within the same country. This was in Kenya, and it depends on the design and implementation of these institutions. Next slide. Okay, so here's some of the gaps in our knowledge. Like I said, there's conflicting results. Sometimes institutions dampen, sometimes they exacerbate tensions. The problem is there's also a lack of temporal trends. As the climate changes, people can change their mind, right? And institutional dynamics change over time. The local scale is often overlooked. I get pushback sometimes on this point as a geographer. We go beyond the scale of the state, which can be emphasized by political scientists and economists. This is important to look at subnational institutions because the state and even county level institutions, they have lower capacity in these peripheral regions compared to local institutions. And there's also this emphasis on formal institutions, but oftentimes it's the informal or a blend of formal and informal through this hybridization that occurs to manage natural resources in marginalized areas. Next slide. Okay. So the research question is generally, under what conditions do pastoralists in arid rangelands support the use of violence? Slide. We hypothesize that when you're like the livelihood security approach, right? So when your livelihood is affected in the absence of institutional support, you are more likely to endorse violence. And our variables, so the IV is just perceived changes in drought severity. It's over a 10-year recall. The dependent variable is support for the use of violence. And then I did a mediation model, which I'll show you in more detail. And basically that's the governance aspect. So how effective you believe the county and traditional elders are managing natural resources. Okay, so this is institutional. This is a framework I've been kind of thinking through. And basically it's about, this is the entire institutional environment. There's these interscalar linkages between what happens over time. So initially you have institutional changes that occur at the macro scale, and this is just the change in governance at the state level. This usually occurs, in the context of colonialism, land tenure changes. Then this can lead to, in the post-colonial era, this mesoscale institutional plurality, where you have this proliferation of both formalized and informalized institutions at the community level. sorry, and the last thing is that this can lead to divergent institutional meanings. So people evaluate institutions based upon how much they benefit from them. So politically, economically, and socially. And so based on these outcomes, divergent institutional meanings, I'd hypothesize, lead to conflict. So next slide, thank you. Okay, so this is a conceptual, this is the causal pathways that that we use to test this relationship, right? So this is adapted from Nina and Buhag's 2020 article, and basically you would expect that climate shocks or variability adversely can affect agricultural production, and this can result in how much these shocks actually translate into lowered opportunity costs to engage in violence. It's conditioned by how effective your institutions are in their capacity to bounce back, right? So how much aid you're being provided, how resources are they equitably distributed, things like that. And so all else being equal, low opportunity results would lead to a higher likelihood that an effective individual would support the use of violence and participate in conflict in a region where there's a high risk of violent conflict. So while not all individuals who support the use of violence actually engage in violence, the opposite should be true. Those who actually participate should also support it. So we just look at support for violence. This is perceptions based. Next slide. Okay, so this is my field site. Isiolo County is located in the arid and semi-arid rangelands of northern Kenya. 70% of the economy is based on livestock. It's resided by mainly pastoralists. In the colonial era, Isiolo is part of the Northern Frontier District, which was a region that was historically marginalized by British colonial rule, and their objectives was security from Ethiopia to the north. And so the NFD was underdeveloped by colonial state, and a lot of the communal property that was used by pastoralists was privatized. Today, the majority of land is categorized as trust land that is administered by county councils on behalf of communities, but there's no full legal property rights. And because of this ambiguity, this can lead to this quasi-communal land tenure where people are still using land in common, and this leads to more fluid land use patterns. And so today in Isiolo, there's perpetual conflict over grazing and water resources between groups in the form of intercommunal raiding of cattle. This has increased in the post-colonial era due to population pressures, divergent historical land claims, and a drying climate. Isiolo is one of the most drought and flood-prone counties in Kenya, and pastoralist ability to deal with the effects of drought is contingent on customary rules that allow flexible and negotiated access to much-needed resources during times of stress. But when these institutional arrangements break down, principles of mutual cooperation and sharing are replaced by animosity and isolation, resulting in undermining pastoralist ability to adapt to the effects of drought. So our data set was collected it was a panel survey, and the first wave was conducted in February 2020. And a lot happened after February 2020. As you know, COVID, there was a locust invasion, but also there was one of the most devastating droughts in the Horn of Africa that started with the onset short rains in March. And so we have a panel survey that goes from February 2020 to May 2022, and the drought worsened during this time. Next slide. These are the 4 pastoralist groups. I'm comparing the Turkana, Samburu, Somali, and Borana. I won't go into much detail on them, but they all reside in Isiolo. Turkana and Samburu are traditionally cattle herders with more generation age set systems and they're less involved in county politics. The Somali are traditionally camel herders, and they have a clan-based system where elders make the decisions with strong political ties in political governance. And the Borana are traditionally camel herders who have uptaken irrigated agriculture in recent years. They are the most politically powerful in Isiolo. They hold most of the county representation, and their institution is based on this hybridized, increasingly formalized institution called DEDA, which I can get into in the Q&A. Next slide. Okay, so quickly, just some summary statistics from our survey. These questions come from the Afrobarometer. So the story basically is that when it comes to regulating use of water and pasture, a majority of respondents, about 70%, said that local traditional rules are regulating resource use. They're also most responsible for sanctioning punishments. And in terms of efficacy, how or badly they're handling natural resource management, the customary traditional elders are faring better than the county government. And the bottom right graph is actually from the most recent Afrobarometer round. And what was interesting about it was similar results. Traditional leaders are almost nearly 30% trust their traditional leaders a lot, while 35% trust their local government council a little. Next slide. So this is the mediation modeling that we used. Like I said, the IV is basically exposure to the drought, and whether this predicts change in violence support is mediated by your trust in governance. Next slide. Okay, so these are the results of the mediation model. They are a bit counterintuitive, but the red bold shows significant mediation, or the indirect effect of the institutional factor on the relationship of perception of drought frequency or severity to change in support for violence. And as you can see, if you trust that your elders are doing a good job managing resources, you're more likely to endorse violence, and it was insignificant for county government effectiveness. Last slide, almost done, I promise. Okay, so just to sum things up, climate change is heavily affecting communities who are reliant on agrarian livelihoods, who reside in the periphery of weak states. And pastoralist groups are historically marginalized by the state and more reliant on these local level institutions to mitigate climate change effects. Results of the median analysis run counter to our expectations. And so this, this might open up an interesting conversation about the context of these institutional environments, how they actually function on the ground, which can inform policymakers and practitioners to promote more effective localized peace building efforts. That's all I got.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
That is great. So maybe let's stop here, pause for a minute with these two presentations before we bring in Jennifer and Roberto. Any questions for either of the presenters at this stage? Please go ahead. And I think you have to speak up for Sarah online. I think she...
Yeah, I have a question for Sarah. Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.